The Byzantine Empire, the Rear Guard of European Civilization, by Edward Ford. Chapter 1. Byzantium and Constantinople, the peerless capital. In the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ, the eastern Mediterranean was bidding fair to become a veritable network of Greek city-states. Never were there such colonizers as these men who had come down from the north and settled on the ruins of the far-famed sea-kingdom of Minos, whose glory they were destined to rival and surpass. Perchance the renown of the Minoan Empire, of which they must have heard, spurred them to emulation. Perhaps they were forced seaward, like other peoples before and since, by pressure from behind. Domestic political troubles undoubtedly played their part in the formation of many of the settlements which covered the shores of the Levant. But when every circumstance is taken into full consideration, the feats of the men of Hellas were wonderful. The wild outburst of colonizing energy which began in the 9th century continued for 2 centuries without a check, and did not slacken until there was scarce any section of eastern Mediterranean coastline, save that of Egypt and Syria, that was not studded with Greek towns. It was not by the great cities of the Golden Age that the work was done. The now forgotten towns of Chalcis and Eretria were the pioneers in Europe. In the 8th and 7th centuries, the lead was taken by famed Miletus, leader of Hellas in many things, until her destruction by Persia in 494 B.C. But Miletus found a not unworthy rival in the European town of Dorian Megara, on the Saronic Gulf. Megarian ships passed up the Hellespont and established settlements on the Asiatic shore of the Propontis, steadily moving forward until, in 675, they founded Chalcedon, or Katikoi, at the entrance of the Thracian Bosphorus. How or why they overlooked the unrivaled site on the Thracian shore for the immeasurably inferior one of Chalcedon is truly difficult of comprehension. Perhaps their fear of the wild folk of the Thracian inland had something to do with it. At any rate, for 16 years Chalcedon was the one Megarian station on the Bosphorus. During that period, the peninsula on which Constantinople was in the far-off future to rise must have become more and more familiar to the men of Megara, and when, in the good old, pious, and very sensible Greek fashion, they made inquiries of the Delphic oracle concerning an eligible site for a new colony, the famous answer, "Build ye opposite to the city of the blind," even if not prepared beforehand, cannot have been unexpected. So one fine day in 660 B.C., the little flotilla of swift black galleys put out of the port of Megara, steered between Salamis and Aegina, and, passing down the Saronic Gulf, rounded Sunium, and stood away across the Aegean. Crossing it, perhaps by 2 or 3 stages, the ships left on their right the far-famed plain where Achaean and Phrygian had contended for 10 long years, perhaps in very deed for a fair, frail woman, as wise old Homer sang, knowing in his wisdom that for women men will ever fight hardest and longest, and, entering Hellespont, wound their way through it into the Propontis. They passed the Perconesus. Perhaps their crews landed there, and if so, they saw that in its marble cliffs lay the material for the future beauty of their projected city. The marble island was left behind, and the galleys headed out over the glittering expanse of open water until before them they saw the narrow, cliff-enclosed opening of the gate of the Euxine, with the town of their blind forerunners to its right, and on its left the low, rolling, triangular peninsula whereon the capital of the Roman Empire was one day to rise. The goal was reached, but though they may have dreamed of great things, the men of Megara, as they raised their first rough fortifications and built the first rude huts and shrines, assuredly did not know that they were engraving on the tablets of history the first words of a story that was to be among the most illustrious of all time. For several centuries after its foundation, Byzantium had an eventful and, on the whole, a prosperous and honorable career. A glance at the map shows its splendid commercial position. It controlled the great trade route between the Aegean and the Euxine. Its vast importance as a frontier fortress between the Orient and the Occident showed itself in the great struggle between Greece and Persia. It was more than once taken and retaken. With comparatively few and brief intervals, it maintained its independence until it fell, with its sisters in East and West, under the all-embracing sway of Rome. And for centuries thereafter it was one of the most important cities of the central regions of the empire. But evil days began for the famous old city on the death of Commodus in 192, when it became the frontier outpost of Pescennius Niger, in his struggle with Septimus Severus. It was taken by Severus in 196, and the grim emperor took his revenge for its 2 years' desperate resistance by massacring the garrison and magistrates, confiscating the property of the citizens, depriving the place of its privileges, and dismantling the walls. Rome owed somewhat to strong L. Septimus Severus, but to mercy and scruple he was a stranger, and probably Caracalla did not inherit all his evil qualities from his mother. Caracalla restored its privileges to the stricken city, but peace knew it not for many years. It was harassed by Gothic raids. It was involved in civil wars. In 263, it was stormed and sacked by Gallienus. Yet its commercial importance was so great that it soon recovered itself, though we are told that scarce a single man of the old Megarian strain survived the slaughter of 196 and 263. Under the Illyrian emperors, it again enjoyed an interval of repose, and Diocletian's residence at Nicomedia must have greatly added to its prosperity. But on his abdication, Byzantium again became a bone of contention between Licinius, Caesar of Illyricum, and Maximinus Daza of the East. The latter, in 314, treacherously seized it behind his colleague's back, only to lose it again in the same year, and to be finally overthrown by Licinius. Licinius, now master of the entire East, greatly strengthened his recovered possession, and made it the strongest fortress of his empire. There now remained, of the various competitors who had disputed the empire after the abdication of Diocletian, two only, Licinius and Flavius Valerius Constantinius, emperor of the West. Causes of rivalry and enmity were not lacking, and in 323 came to head an open war. Licinius was defeated and slain, and Byzantium for the last time taken, this time by the man who was to make it famous for evermore, for in 328 Constantine finally decided to make it the capital of the Roman Empire. The reasons which led him to supersede the city of the Tiber need only be briefly mentioned. A short study of the map of the Mediterranean basin is sufficient to demonstrate them. Rome was a bad position from which to direct the defense of the Danubian frontier, the most vulnerable part of the Roman border. It had been a splendid starting point for the conquest of Italy, largely because it was the point of meeting of three nations, but as the capital of the empire it was full of defects. It had no proper communication with the sea. It was shut off from the main body of the state by the great barrier of the Alps. Finally, all through the 3rd and 4th centuries, the center of political gravity was shifting steadily eastwards. It is doubtful whether it had not begun to do so long before. Rome had already lost all but the superstitious reverence which was paid to it as the legendary mistress of the world. It seems to have had little or no commercial importance. It was only a vast assemblage of magnificent public buildings and streets, surrounded by walls that, for all the use they were, had better never have been built, inhabited by a huge, debased, pauperized population, a mere source of endless trouble and expense. The merits of Byzantium were apparent to none more clearly than to Constantine, who had been encamped outside it for nearly a year, and had ample time to appreciate at their full value its many advantages. It lay on the borderline between East and West, and right on one of the most important of the great trade routes. Its military position was exceptionally fine. Not only was it tactically most impregnable, if properly fortified and guarded, but it was a strategic center of the first order, an unrivaled place of arms for war on land and sea. On the Asiatic side, it was covered by the great wet ditch of the Bosphorus, impassable to any enemy not possessed of a navy. Even if Chalcedon and Chrysopolis were lost, the power which held Byzantium, so long as it maintained a naval force, was still unassailable. On the side of Europe, Hymus and Rhodope covered Thrace and Byzantium if the line of the Danube were forced, and the city at the end of its long dwindling peninsula was the natural base for advance and the goal of retreat, the true center and rallying point of the strength of the empire. We need not deal with the supposed marvels that are said to have attended the second foundation of Byzantium. All through 328 and 329, the work went steadily on, and on May 11th, 330, the city was solemnly dedicated and consecrated, with Christian ceremonies, though Constantine was yet unbaptized. It was renamed New Rome by imperial edict, but from the very first the name of its founder clung to it, and for 16 centuries the world has stoutly refused to give the city of the Bosphorus any other title than that of Constantinople. The name of the first Christian emperor of Rome has most rightly been ever associated with that of the city which he chose from among many as the capital of his empire, while with the appellation of the state which centered in it is justly connected with the name of the Megarian leader who colonized the unrivaled site which the blind men before him had neglected for Chalcedon. Constantinople, as planned by Constantine, did not cover the area over which it spread in after years. The length of its walls was barely 8 miles, and the extent of ground enclosed only half of what it afterwards became. In 413, the great prefect Anthemius began the construction of a new line of fortifications on the landward side, from 3/4 of a mile to a mile in advance of the Constantinian wall. This was ruined by an earthquake in 447, at a moment of extreme peril, when the terrible Attila was but a few marches away. But in 60 days the shattered barrier was defensible once more, and soldiers, citizens, and craftsmen were laboring feverishly at the construction of a second wall in front of the first. In succeeding years the work was completed, and in the days when the warrior Marcianus and the Saint Pulcheria again renewed the glory of the empire, the great capital stood forth in all its splendor and enduring strength. The length of its fortifications extended to about 13 miles. From the marble tower on the Propontis to the Xyloporta on the Golden Horn stretched for 4 miles a vast bulwark of defense. For the greater part of its length it was triple. First came a huge moat, 60 feet wide and at least 20 feet deep, with a low stone wall or breastwork along its inner edge. Behind the breastwork was, and is, an esplanade about 40 feet wide, overlooked by the outer, really the second, wall, a structure from 25 to 30 feet high and 7 feet thick, strengthened by casemates on its inner side, with towers about 40 feet in height, projecting at short intervals. The earth was banked up against its inner side and leveled to form a second esplanade, averaging 60 feet in width, from the city side of which rose the inner wall, a huge barrier 45 feet from base to battlement, rising in places to 50 feet or more, with a solid thickness of about 15 feet, and with 97 towers along its front, projecting about 30 feet into the peribolos, or esplanade, and rising to an average height of over 60 feet. This gigantic system of fortifications did not extend quite to the Golden Horn, but extended at the Xylocercus gate, a 1/4 of a mile short of it, whence a single wall, like a bastion round the quarter of the Blacherne. This single wall, however, extended and strengthened by several emperors, was of great strength and solidity, and, though undefended by a ditch, appeared so strong to Muhammad II in 1453 that he did not care to direct his attack against it. The entire shoreline along the Golden Horn and the Propontis was defended by walls, lower and weaker than the vast landward bulwarks, of course, but strengthened by some 300 towers, and, as events showed, strong enough for all purposes, except the unforeseen chance of a total lack of ships and trained defenders. The imperial palatial enclosure lay at the eastern end of the city, along the Propontine shore. In a work of the small dimensions of the present one, space would be wasted in attempting any description. It was more of what in Russia is called a Kreml than a palace, containing several imperial residences and a number of churches, barracks, armories, storehouses, and extensive gardens and playing fields. Beneath its walls on the city side lay the two famous churches of the Divine Wisdom and of Saint Irene, the Hippodrome and the Palace of the Patriarch, which, before its main gate, opened the Augustion, or Imperial Square, from which the main thoroughfare of the city ran westward for more than a mile, traversing the fora of Constantine and Theodosius, and presently dividing into two branches, one passing northwestward to the gate of Adrianople by the great church of the Holy Apostles, the mausoleum of the emperors, one running parallel to the Propontine shore to the famous Golden Gate, beneath whose arches conquering emperors entered in triumphal procession into the city of their pride. The means do not exist of mapping or describing the city in the days of its greatest prosperity, which were probably in the 10th century, but only 100 years after its foundation it counted over 250 large public buildings and 4,400 private dwellings belonging to wealthy or distinguished citizens. A feature of the city was the gigantic reservoirs for public water supply. Valens constructed an aqueduct which was broken in the great siege of 626 and restored by Constantine VI more than a century later. Churches were to be counted probably by the 100 rather than the score. Many yet survive, desecrated and defiled by the presence of the barbarians, who are still encamped in the city of Constantine, among them the wondrous Sancta Sophia and Saint Irene. But the Church of the Holy Apostles was destroyed to make way for the mosque of the conqueror Muhammad II, as the imperial palaces and hundreds of other buildings of antiquarian and historical interest were swept away either by barbarous Europe or barbarous Asia in the ruin and desolation that supervened after the sack of 1204. The suburbs of the great capital were Galata across the Golden Horn, Chrysopolis and Chalcedon on the Asiatic shore of the Bosphorus. The great port was, of course, the Golden Horn, but on the Propontine side there were 4 basins of larger or smaller size, one of which, however, belonged exclusively to the imperial palace. It is impossible to estimate the population with any certainty. It is supposed at the present day to be about or over 1 million, but of course no reliance can be placed upon Turkish returns. The area of the Stamboulene Peninsula is about 4,000 acres, according to the writer's very rough calculations, which at the rate, a high one compared with that of London, of 100 inhabitants per acre would give it a population of 400,000. Many writers estimate it at 1 million or more, but I do not see that it can ever have greatly exceeded 500,000. It is true that the city parks and pleasure gardens, then as now, were without the walls, but there were many large squares and unoccupied spaces within them. Possibly, allowing for the denser crowding which prevailed in antiquity, and the population of the Asiatic and European suburbs, there may have been at times as many as 700,000 inhabitants. Of the city's wealth, there can be no doubt. For several centuries it was the commercial capital of Europe and of a considerable part of Asia, and for a great part of that period it had no foreign rival. Benjamin of Tudela thinks that in the 12th century, when the Italian republics were already competing with it, its yearly contribution to the imperial revenue was 7,300,000 nomistata, or over £4,000,000. Gibbon can hardly credit this. From the standpoint of the 18th century, he cannot be blamed for his incredulity. But it is quite probable. Constantinople was to the empire what London is to Britain, only more so, for during a large part of its existence it had few foreign rivals or none, and there was no city in the Byzantine dominions to approach it, far less equal it. It was the terminus of the chief routes of the empire. It lay upon a main artery of medieval commerce, and the ruin in Western Europe drove trade and industry more and more to the east, thus adding to its already great commercial prosperity. It was the greatest fortress, the greatest naval station, the greatest arsenal of the state. Its chief university, its religious center, its seat of government, its commercial focus. In short, as few cities have ever been, or can be, the true natural center of the empire, its queen of cities, the heart and soul of its national existence. Indeed, a peerless capital. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2. Constantine to Arcadius, Barbarian Influence, A.D. 337 to 408. The Roman Empire after the death of Constantine I, Gothic invasions, Theodosius I, internal condition of the empire, Arcadius, Rufinus, Eutropius, and Gainas. Defeat and death of Gainas, John Chrysostom, and Aelia Eudoxia. Death of Arcadius. It is not proposed here to do more than to give the slightest possible sketch of the history of the period 337 to 395, between the death of Constantine the Great and the accession of the brothers Arcadius and Honorius. It was an epoch of considerable interest and importance, but it lies outside the limits which I have laid down, arbitrarily I own, and the time which would be expended in describing the deeds of Constantius the Arian and Julian the Apostate is better employed in attempting to throw some light on the general state of the empire at this period. It is necessary to glance at the events of these years, however, in order to understand something of the circumstances which, directly or indirectly, brought about the great changes of the following century. Constantine left the empire proportioned out between three sons, but by 353 the whole huge heritage had once more been concentrated in the hands of Constantius II, Emperor of the East. He is chiefly noted for having broken with the orthodox standard of Christianity and having adopted the Arian heresy, which denied the divinity of Christ, and for this reason has incurred considerable obloquy. He was unamiable, harsh, and unsympathetic, as indeed his whole house appeared to have been, but was by no means devoid of the great ability which went hand in hand with their evil qualities. To him succeeded in 361 that strange and, to the writer at least, pathetic figure, Julian the Apostate, and on his death in Persia in 363, after a brief interval of Jovianus, the hasty and ill-advised choice of the imperial staff, the stout soldier Valentinian I. Valentinian chose the West as his sphere of operations and crowned his brother Valens Emperor of the East. Valens has not had a good reputation in history, But it really seems as if, with all his faults, it was not he who was to blame for the disasters which befell the East under his rule, but bad and selfish officialdom. The Goths were now definitely settled in the regions north of the Danube and the Black Sea. The Visigoths lay spread over what had been the old Roman province of Dacia, and were steadily drawing nearer to the empire, becoming less and less of a danger, more and more of what we should now term a buffer state. Their young men enlisted freely in the Roman armies, and since the nation mustered more than 200,000 vigorous males, formed a most important source of strength to the declining empire. Declining chiefly, it must be remembered, by reason of its steadily dwindling population. The Goths were, nominally at least, Christians. They had become cultivators and in some cases traders. There certainly was no reason to believe that they were to be before long the most terrible enemies of the empire. Probably most men of the later 4th century would have pointed to Persia as the great antagonist of Rome, and would have indicated the Rhine, the Euphrates, or Britain as the points of danger, rather than the lower Danube. Somewhere about 210 B.C., if the writer's conclusions are correct, the consolidation of China into a single powerful state under that giant among rulers, Cheng of the kingdom of Qin, Qin Shi Huang Ti, had opposed a firm barrier to the eastward progress of the peoples of Central Asia. Prominent among these people were the Huang Nu, a race mentioned again and again in terms of terror and respect by Chinese writers. Qin Shi Huang Ti defeated them in 215, and constructed on his northern border, where nature had placed no barrier, an artificial one, a gigantic military frontier, the Great Wall of China, the hugest structure, reckoned as mere mass and taking no account of the engineering feats involved, that human hands have ever reared. The result of this astounding creation of genius was, as it seems perfectly clear to me, to gradually force the Huangnu westward, that they gave way very slowly, and that the gradual migration or infiltration of their hordes across the great Eurasian plains took some centuries rather than generations, is natural enough. They were probably loath to leave the vicinity of the rich lands which had once been their raiding ground, and must have had to fight every mile of their long journey westward. And though this is not the place wherein to take up the question of the origin of the Huns, I must own that it seems curious that the Romans of the 5th century should have known the terrible Mongol horde which nearly made an end of their dissolving empire, by a name which is almost the same as that of the nation which had terrorized China under the Zhou dynasty 7 centuries before. The hideous aspect of the Mongol hordes, their ferocity and bestiality, seem to have utterly cowed the fine German races with which they came in contact. The Ostrogoths were subjugated. The Visigoths, in terror and despair, retreated to the Danube, and begged the Roman garrisons to let them pass. After some hesitation, Valens assented. The Goths crossed the great river and were fairly in Roman territory. There were doubtless difficulties, but none that could not be smoothed over by care and considerate treatment. But care was the last thing to be expected from the greedy and unscrupulous Roman officials. The details may be gathered from Ammianus, but it must suffice here to say that the Goths were literally goaded into war by treatment such as even slaves were scarce likely to endure without murmuring. Their patience was admirable. It was not until Lupicianus, the scoundrelly governor of Moesia, actually proceeded to attempt the murder of the Gothic chief, Fritigern, and some of the nobles that the long-suffering Teutons took up arms in 376. Next year they ravaged Moesia and measured swords with the army of Illyricum in a fierce battle at Ad Salicis. And in 378 they passed the Balkans, wasted Thrace, and shattered the imperial army of the East into ruin at Adrianople. Valens was slain, and with him lay the dead magistri equitum et petidum, the count of the palace, 35 generals, and 40,000 officers and men. The disaster was a fearful one, yet the Goths made no special use of it. They were not a disciplined and organized force, but a nation army. The tens of thousands of splendid warriors were accompanied and hampered by vast crowds of non-combatants, and by endless trains of heavy and clumsy wagons. Despite their magnificent victory, they could not take Adrianople, and passing it by, poured down the Thracian promontory to Constantinople. Only 40 years after the death of Constantine, the prescience which had chosen Byzantium as the new capital received its first justification. The oncoming host of victorious warriors gazed in silent dismay upon the great city and its massive fortifications, and abandoning the siege train which they had gathered for the assault, retreated inland. Constantinople had saved itself and the empire. The Spaniard Theodosius, who by the choice of Gratian, Emperor of the West, succeeded the unfortunate Valens, took up again the policy of conciliation, but with less prospect of ultimate success, since deprived of a great part of the military strength which had been at the disposal of his predecessor, he held a much less commanding position. The Goths were settled in the Illyrian provinces, and the danger of the renewed hostility was averted, only temporarily as it turned out, by the expedient of enlisting their horsemen wholesale into the army. Considering that Theodosius had hardly any other alternative, the plan was not perhaps a bad one. Had he lived 10 years longer, it might have been a permanent success, but he undoubtedly carried it too far. Under his system, the pay of a Gothic trooper was higher than that of his native comrade. That is, the emperor practically published the fact that the Goths were better and more reliable troops than the born subjects of the empire. It may have been true, though I see no especial reason for thinking so, but it was surely folly to admit it. The Goths found themselves and their tribal chiefs in many respects the rulers of the empire's destiny, and their probably high opinion of themselves was greatly raised, while the natives, neglected and disregarded, became steadily less efficient. Otherwise, the policy had evil results in that it greatly increased the military expenditure at a time when the most careful economy in every department was urgently demanded. On this subject I shall have more to say shortly. But taking all the unfavorable circumstances of the time into consideration, the facts remain that there was plenty of good fighting material among the peoples of the empire, that the loss of revenue was hardly likely to be fatal even if 50,000 Isaurians or Illyrians had been levied from the taxpayers to fill the chasm made in the ranks of the army by the catastrophe of Adrianople. That a diminution of revenue would probably have injured the empire less than the increased taxation necessary to pay the Goths, and that finally the success of the policy rested upon the life of Theodosius. A policy contrived upon such a fragile basis as human existence has but a very uncertain chance of continuance. In other ways, too, Theodosius cannot be described as in any sense an emperor of exceptional merit. He was certainly an able general, he was active and hard-working, but he had no true conception of the needs of the times. His measures were calculated rather to add to the public burdens than to relieve them, and he can hardly be defended against the charge of reckless cruelty. Witness the shocking incident of the massacre at Thessalonica. He owes his title of great to his orthodoxy, not to his merits as a ruler. We shall meet with more than one similar instance later on. The chaos which set in after his death is perhaps a good testimony to his merits, but is equally his condemnation. We cannot applaud a sovereign whose work, in not the worst of circumstances by any means, can only endure for his own lifetime. Theodosius left the empire to his two young sons, Arcadius, 18 years of age, and Honorius, who was only 10. To the former was left the East, the main strength of the state; to the latter, the much weaker and less prosperous West, and both were surrounded by a number of generals and ministers, almost all of barbarian or half-barbarian origin. The two young emperors were almost absolute nonentities. Arcadius was a thin, dark, nerveless stripling, always seemingly half asleep and without energy even to speak. Honorius is best remembered by the famous story of his pet fowl, Roma. Considered as rulers, there is little to choose between them. Both were certain to be the tools and dupes of any ambitious and unscrupulous minister. The internal condition of the Roman Empire at the death of Theodosius was full of danger, but though the situation was critical, an emperor like Diocletian, or even a mere resolute fighting man, might well have retrieved it. With two weak and almost idiotic boys on the throne, there was perhaps little to be looked for but disaster. The imperial government had for centuries been steadily tending to become more and more centralized, and this tendency had been materially helped forward by the troubles of the 3rd century. The reorganization of Diocletian marked an attempt to secure the advantages of decentralization by dividing the vast empire into 4 great regions, each with its chief, but the finely conceived scheme hardly survived the abdication of its author. 4 emperors of varying blood and capacity were little likely to be able to work in harmony. Dissension soon broke out, and ended in the accession of Constantine I to supreme power. Constantine continued the reorganization which Diocletian had initiated. One feature of Diocletian's system, a strange one when we consider that its author was a peasant by birth, was the placing of the emperor in a position of unapproachable majesty. No doubt Diocletian hoped thus to establish some kind of check upon the constant military revolts which threatened the public stability. He wished, in short, to elevate the head of the state to a position of earthly isolation and glory, which should in some degree coordinate with his theoretical half-religious place in the economy of the Roman world as Divus Augustus. The disadvantage that the emperor might be so cut off from his subjects as to have slight conception of their needs and interests, he does not appear to have foreseen. At all events, he ignored them. Diocletian's system, elaborated by Constantine, made necessary a splendid and expensive court. The defense of the empire against its enemies involved a huge increase in the standing army. The 300,000 troops kept up by Augustus had grown to over 600,000 in the time of Theodosius I. While the weight of taxation was steadily on the increase, the population of the empire was slowly wasting all through the first 4 centuries of the Christian era. In a society whose normal condition is that of intermittent war, it is clear that the small freeholder is at a great disadvantage beside his large holding neighbor, who can till his fields with hired or slave labor in time of hostilities, while he himself must leave his farm more or less uncared for. If both be spoiled by an enemy, the greater proprietor retains the advantage, since he can utilize his greater means to recuperate. In course of time, the smallholder is crowded or wasted out of existence. This is little better than a truism. It has been so often demonstrated that I confine myself to repeating it. As early as 150 B.C., Italy was in a serious condition from depopulation owing to the above cause, and reformers again and again made desperate attempts to check the evil, which were wreaked upon the bitter opposition of the great landowners. Under the empire, great numbers of the Italian people were state paupers, residing in Rome and maintained by state ministrations, which absorbed a considerable portion of the revenue. When Constantinople was founded, its people also were supported by state grants of food. The condition was a terrible one, but it is fair to remember that it was largely due, in the first case, to the grasping selfishness of great landowners, who would not allow their poor neighbors a chance to work and live. Immorality of a bad type was distressingly common. The prevalence of slavery fostered self-indulgence and cruelty. Infanticide was frequently practiced. The strenuous efforts of the emperors produced for a while a certain promise of better things. There was a considerable resuscitation of free labor, but the necessities of the fist soon involved the free laborer in the toils of the caste system of the administration, which chained every man to his craft, and in the 3rd century he was already a serf. Immorality the emperors could not check. Many of them indeed were guilty of it, and partly from economic, partly from moral causes, the population was stationary at best, probably diminishing, while the conditions were against its recovery after any disaster. The great plague of the reign of Marcus Aurelius was the beginning of the end, and the anarchy of the 3rd century helped it forward. In the 4th century, Roman society had become stereotyped into castes rigidly defined, controlled by an all-pervading bureaucracy, and ground down by grievous and ever more grievous taxation. The principal source of revenue appears to have been the land tax, which varied from 1/20 to 1/5 of the value of the annual production of the soil, and was usually about 1/10, not a light burden at the time. All non-land-holding freemen were liable to a heavy capitation tax. Constantine, confronted with the deficit, closed it by imposing a class tax on senators, which was probably defensible, and a tax on all receipts, which necessarily pressed cruelly on the poor, and was repealed by Anastasius amid general rejoicings. The local assembly, curia, was collectively responsible for the amounts of the district taxes as fixed by the imperial officials. If any member of the curia became bankrupt, the sum still had to be made up, and as it was too often impossible to wring it out of the poverty-stricken serfs, the other members were forced to contribute. The results were disastrous. At first the curiales acted in collusion with the provincial governors and occasionally escaped at the expense of the exchequer. But the ever-growing strictness of the tax collectors gradually closed this outlet of evasion, and the wretched notables, tied to their estates and chairs as much as the serf was chained to his plot and his hut, had recourse to any and every means to escape their crushing responsibilities. The principle of taxation was simply to collect in the treasury as much as possible of the circulating medium. Other considerations were ignored. Naturally, the result was lack of capital, consequent decrease in the means of life, and the acceleration of the decline of the population. Taxpayers were sternly forbidden to bear arms, lest there should be a decline of revenue, and the army, when the supply of camp children failed, was recruited more and more from barbarians, until Theodosius I put the capstone on its denationalization by swamping it with Goths, while he ground the wretched taxpayers still more into the dust to provide his new favorites with high pay. The curiales were landowners, but not of noble or senatorial rank. They represented the upper middle class, to use the clumsy modern term. Below them were a few freemen, save merchants and tradesmen. The agricultural laborers were almost all serfs or slaves. At its best the curial system was bad, for the curia, being composed of the richest landowners of the district, was not identified in its interests with the smaller proprietors and the traders. The small holders disappeared first, but at last the curiales disintegrated under the ruthless pressure. The nobles probably evaded their obligation as far as possible. In any case, they had the best chance of survival, and by the time of Valentinian III, the conditions in the West were appalling. The population was practically reduced to beggary. Vandal piracy had bankrupted many traders, Barbarian ravages had ruined the small and medium landowners, but there was a group of nobles with incomes ranging from £60,000 up to £200,000 a year. Comment is needless. These fared better. The economic conditions had never been so bad. The trading classes were much larger and more influential than in the agricultural West. Serfage was perhaps less widespread. Finally, the country, in Asia at least, was untouched by war. The East also was blessed with stronger rulers. So while the West broke into fragments, the East survived and had enough of health within it to be able to recuperate, not once but several times, to the astonishment of mankind. The history of the reign of Arcadius is sufficiently dreary, but is on the whole less gloomy than that of his brother's rule over the West. He was at first under the domination of his ambitious minister Rufinus, but he soon fell under the influence of a eunuch, Eutropius, and a Gothic general, Gainas. Instigated by them, he espoused the half-barbarian daughter of the Frank chief Bauto instead of Maria, the daughter of Rufinus, and the latter was soon assassinated at a review by order of his enemies. Gainas next, in 401, ousted and murdered Eutropius, in spite of the intrepid defense of the fallen minister made by the famous John, Patriarch of Constantinople, whom the admiring populace called Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed. Meanwhile, the Illyrian provinces were in wild disorder. There Alaric, the famous Visigoth king, was in open revolt. The pretext of the rising was arrears of pay to the foederati, the barbarian troops of the army. But there is little doubt that Alaric's ambition was the main cause. Stilicho, the great Vandal magister militum of the West, checked him, but with the curious tortuous policy which so often fills us in doubt of his loyalty to the empire, concluded peace without crushing his rival, and procured for him the post of magister militum per Illyricum. For 5 years Alaric remained comparatively quiescent, if by no means idle. Then in 401, while Gainas was plotting against Eutropius, he invaded Italy. With his operations there, his final success, and his death, we are not immediately concerned. Possibly he had concerted measures with Gainas, who was now all-powerful in the East. But Gainas was not Alaric, nor had he the great host of splendid fighters which followed the Visigoth. The people of Constantinople, growing enraged at the insolence of the Germans, broke out into resistance. They closed the gates, cutting off Gainas and the troops outside from those within, and then turning savagely on the latter, killed over 7,000 of them. Gainas now declared open war on his master, but he was met by Fravitta, a fine specimen of the hard-fighting, rough, honest heathen Teuton. Fravitta stood by the son of his friend and lord Theodosius, defeated Gainas, and drove him across the Danube, where he was killed by Uldes, king of the Huns, who were now in force in Dacia. The rest of the reign of Arcadius passed in comparative peace, except for continual trouble between John Chrysostom and the Empress Aelia Eudocia. Neither side appears to great advantage. The Empress was impulsive, hot-tempered, vindictive with the fierceness of her barbarian nature, certainly vain and frivolous, but does not appear to have been fundamentally vicious. The Patriarch was a man of saintly life, disinterested, brave, universally beloved, but rash and impulsive, and most violent in speech. He assailed the imperial lady to her face as she sat in Sancta Sophia. To be called Jezebel was more than she could endure, yet her violent impulses were as much good as bad, and she seems to have made repeated attempts to live on good terms with the saintly but impracticable priest. A little gentleness might have converted the lovely, hot-tempered Frank into a passionately faithful friend, but John's invective only grew fiercer as time went on. He had no tact, and, as it seems to the writer, no great share of Christian charity, for comparatively slight faults. The end came in 404. Eudocia, now utterly reckless, instigated her inert spouse into having the patriarch arrested and banished. His patience under the hardships of his exile was wonderful, and there was deep pathos in his lonely death. But no one, except religious enthusiasts devoid of judgment, can help wishing that he had been able to control his violent impulses a little. The good which he would have accomplished would have far exceeded that which he was actually able to do, great as it undoubtedly was. The plea has been advanced by Kingsley that it was the utter badness and rottenness of the times that made the great contemporary Christian fathers so intolerant and often barbarous. It may be so, but it is a terrible indictment of Christianity that in 4 centuries it had done so little. As a fact, the 4th and 5th centuries were a period of steady moral advance. There were both bad and good emperors after Diocletian, but no one of the type of Nero or Caracalla. Theodosius I conducted a veritable crusade against sexual immorality. The Roman of A.D. 404 was decidedly more civilized than the Roman of 4 B.C. The times may have been bad, but they were better than of old, in the moral sense at least. Paganism existed, but it was moribund. Christianity may have had to fight hard, but it had done, and was to do, splendid and deathless work. It was not the wonderful religion that was at fault, nor yet the times. It was the violent ignorance, intolerance, and dissension of narrow Christian ecclesiastics that retarded progress. Saint Cyril of Alexandria was almost certainly morally guilty of the murder of the pagan philosopher Hypatia, and his action does not appear to have been generally disapproved of. Chrysostom was a man of a far higher order than Cyril, yet he too was the slave of his prejudices, terribly devoid of the true spirit of Christianity. Eudocia did not long survive her enemy. Needless to say, she is supposed to have died in deep remorse and misery. The opponent of St. John Chrysostom could have no other fate. She died in childbirth in September 405. On May 1st, 408, Arcadius, whose affection for her seems to have been the single positive emotion of his otherwise inert existence, followed her. His last arrangement showed a degree of wisdom which he had never yet manifested. He appointed Anthemius the Praetorian prefect, a man of high ability and entire disinterestedness, regent for his little son Theodosius. He was laid beside his wife in the Church of the Holy Apostles. End of section 2.
The Byzantine Empire, the Rearguard of European Civilization by Edward Ford. Chapter 3. Theodosius II to Justin I. Reorganization. A.D. 408 to 527. Regency of Anthemius. Reign of Theodosius II. Pulcheria, Eudocia, Persian and Hunnic wars, intervention in the West, Chrysaphius, Hunnic invasions, religious troubles, Pulcheria and Marcianus, revival, repulse of Huns, Council of Chalcedon, Leo I, Zeno, decline of barbarian influence, Anastasius I, internal reforms, Isaurian and Persian wars, revolt of Vitalian, Justin I, Justinian, his character and curious marriage, his accession. The death of Arcadius in some sense synchronizes with the passing away of the epoch of barbarian influence. Such a general statement, of course, must only be considered as partially correct. Barbarian influence continued to exist for a very considerable period at Constantinople. The Alan Magister Militum Ardaburius and his son Aspar were powerful, and later showed signs of becoming dangerously so. But though Aspar may perhaps be reckoned in the same category with Stilicho and Ricimer, he never really exercised their commanding influence. Neither can it be said with any truth that the Ostrogoth chieftains Theodoric, with whom we shall presently become acquainted, had much chance of dominating the empire, though they certainly appeared likely at one time to establish a Teutonic kingdom in the Balkan peninsula. The darkest day of the later Roman Empire has passed, and with Theodosius II we enter upon a period of transition to the epoch of reform which was to bear its part in the burst of energy under Justinian I. The Praetorian prefect Anthemius proved himself worthy of his dead master's unexpectedly wise choice. No taint of self-interest marked his conduct, a feature so rare as to deserve special mention though Anthemius had done nothing else worthy of record. Such, however, was far from the case. He concluded an advantageous commercial treaty with Persia. When Uldis, king of the formidable Huns, invaded Mysia, he drove him across the Danube, and protected the border by systematic refortification, supported by a flotilla on the great river. He set on foot measures for resuscitating the wasted Illyrian provinces. He reorganized the corn-supplying machinery of the capital, and traced out and in large measure constructed new fortifications for the capital, nearly a mile in advance of the walls of Constantine, thus well nigh doubling the size of the city. But his greatest glory was that in 414 a general remission of arrears of taxes for 40 years, from 368 to 408, was proclaimed. To the burdened tax-paying classes, who must have been overwhelmed with their obligations, this cannot but have been of inestimable benefit. The great prefect died in 414, but it was clearly his influence, if not his actual personal order, that was responsible for the boon. He had conferred another benefit on the empire by the careful education which he had caused to be imparted to his imperial charges. Theodosius II, indeed, was only a little less of a nonentity than his father, but his sister Pulcheria, 2 years his senior, was a very different person. On the death of Anthemius, possibly or indeed probably by his influence and advice, she was proclaimed Augusta, and took up the reins of government in the name of her brother, being then only 15 years of age. Women mature earlier in the East than under our own cloudy skies, and Pulcheria was not so young as her scanty tale of years might seem to indicate. But there is something infinitely touching in the spectacle of this girl taking up her terrible burden of empire at an age when even Eastern women were thinking of the enjoyments of youth. Pulcheria took religious vows, and remained a virgin to the end of her life. Her marriage at the age of 50 was merely nominal. It may very well have been a genuine religious impulse, but seeing that her sisters Marina and Arcadia both followed her example, and that the daughters of the fiery Eudoxia were hardly likely to have been devoid of human passion, it more probably originated in the desire of the Augusta to remove herself and her sisters beyond the reach of ambitious aspirants to their hands. The latter theory is at once the more probable and the more honorable. It is more probable because Pulcheria never secluded herself. She toiled diligently at state business all her life, and she assuredly had little leisure for ceremonial mortification of the flesh. She did what few women could do or have done. She kept her vow of virginity in the world. It is the more honorable because monachism is too often another name for mere selfishness of the worst sort, a desire to save the individual soul with utter disregard of anything else. Pulcheria's vow was for the good of humanity. Had she remained free, she might well have been a centre for plots against her brother. Her self-abnegation secured the peace of the Roman world in the East. Her motives were indeed religious in the highest and noblest sense of the word, since her object was purely unselfish, the benefit of her fellow creatures. In all her life there is not a sign that she ever took herself into consideration. She toiled only for her brother. Her existence was a long self-denial. More than once it must have been very like a martyrdom. Her sisters, who followed her example, have every right to share in her fame, though they do not appear to have mingled to any extent in public life. The long reign of Theodosius the Younger was on the whole peaceful. Its great monument was the Codex Theodosianus, which was commenced in 429 and completed in 438. Its inception may be set down with certainty to the credit of Pulcheria and the senators who worked with her at the task of reorganizing the empire. The value of a systematic codification of the laws needs no emphasizing. The Augusta is said also to have set her face steadily against the corruption of the court. Here, however, she was face to face with an Augean stable, and her efforts to cleanse it were only partially successful. She failed, as any woman in similar circumstances must fail, to see the crying need of military reorganization. The Roman armies continued to be assemblages of barbarian foederati and mercenaries, led by barbarian or half-barbarian chiefs like Ardaburius and Aspar, whose fidelity was always doubtful. Yet for the present there was no trouble. The house of Theodosius was popular with the Teutons. The Augusta's personal influence may have counted for much. At any rate, there is no hint of mutiny during her reign. We must always remember that Pulcheria owed much to the precepts of Anthemius, and we do not know how much of her policy was really his. But in any case she deserves credit for intelligently carrying it out, and the glory of having kept her weak brother steadily in a dignified course of action for many years is all her own. Pulcheria very early in life had taken into her friendship a Greek girl named Athenaeus, who had fled penniless from the persecution of her brothers at Athens to seek the protection of the young Augusta. Athenaeus was a daughter of the philosopher Leontius. She was also a pagan, a fact which is worth recording to show how far removed Pulcheria was from bigotry. The young Athenian was converted to Christianity and baptized by the name of Eudocia. Theodosius fell in love with her, and in 421, being then 20 years of age, he took her to wife. He was so much influenced by his sister that we must assume the marriage to have had her strong approval. There is every reason to believe that she had been a good friend of the beautiful pagan, who had in her need cast herself at her feet years before. In after years there was disagreement between the imperial ladies, but there is nothing to show that there was any political reason for it. The children of the union, except a daughter who bore her mother's name, died young, and in 444 Theodosius separated from Eudocia and exiled her to Jerusalem. The story grew up in after years that the empress was guilty of a criminal passion for Paulinus, one of the great court officials, but the story of the Phrygian apple which Eudocia received from her husband only to pass it on to her lover probably belongs to the region of romance. At the same time, the story is found in several Byzantine historians, and there was probably some reason for the divorce by a normally good-natured man of the wife with whom he had lived for 20 years. In 421 war broke out with Persia. It lasted for 2 years and terminated in favor of the empire in 422. Its cause had really been the persecution of Christians carried on by King Bahram, and its successful issue strengthened the prestige of the empire in the east, which had declined since Jovian's ignominious peace in 363. But next year, before the main body of the army had returned from the Persian frontier, the Huns broke into the Balkan Peninsula and ravaged the whole country north of Adrianople. The government, unable to repel force by force, could only adopt the ignominious policy of buying them off by a yearly subsidy of £700 of gold. The reason was that the army was needed for an expedition into the Western Empire, but the precedent was a bad one. In the west, Honorius had died in 423. The government was seized or assumed. It must always be remembered that there was no definite law of succession, by Johannes, the primicerius or first secretary. Placidia, stepsister of Honorius, and widow of his colleague Constantius III, was at the time living in Constantinople, whither intrigues at Ravenna had forced her to retire, and she now claimed the crown for her son Valentinian. The eastern army, under the Ardaburius, entered Italy, and though he was himself shipwrecked and taken, his son Aspar stormed Aquileia, and Ravenna was surrendered without resistance. Johannes was captured and executed. The Eastern Empire was to receive as guerdon for its aid Western Illyricum, the cession to take place when Valentinian should be of age to marry Eudocia, the daughter of Theodosius. It was clearly wise policy to get as much of the shattered empire as possible added to the still vigorous eastern portion, but the Illyrian provinces were so wasted as to be of little value, and their possession by Theodosius was never more than nominal. Valentinian III and Eudocia were duly married in 436. The young emperor was probably the worst of the line of Theodosius, vindictive, incapable, and faithless to a wife who seems to have loved him only too well. The marriage, however, marked the high water mark of the prosperity of Theodosius II, and also the culminating point of the influence of Pulcheria. There were always men who challenged her primacy in her brother's regard, but soon after 436 we begin to hear more and more of the eunuch Grand Chamberlain Chrysaphius. It was perhaps by his machinations that Eudocia was separated from her husband. It is certain that Pulcheria's hold on her brother was becoming relaxed. The last 10 years of the reign of Theodosius II, during which the ambitious eunuch was steadily becoming supreme, were dark and disastrous. An expedition against the Vandals, now firmly established in Africa under their great king Gaiseric, ended in ignominious failure, and in 441 Attila, king of the Huns, burst into the Illyrian provinces. He stormed every fortress along the Danube but one, and for several years worked his will in the Balkan peninsula. 3 Roman armies perished in Thrace and Mysia. 70 cities were stormed and ruined. Negotiations were opened with the victorious barbarian in 443, but they soon fell through, and Attila, practically master of the waste that had been eastern Illyricum, might have looked forward to the sack of Constantinople. In 447 came the final blow. At the end of January, an earthquake occurred in Eastern Europe and Asia Minor. Many cities suffered severely. Great part of Constantinople was ruined, and nearly the whole of the landward wall, with 57 towers, was overthrown. The danger was appalling. The Huns were in Thrace. The loss of Constantinople would mean the end of all things for the empire, but the wild energy of the people saved the state. Every craftsman in Constantinople was set to labor on the fortifications. The city demes supplied 16,000 able-bodied citizens as laborers. In 60 days the wall of Anthemius was repaired and defensible, and a second rampart under construction in front of it. The city could not be easily taken now, even if the defenders had been less numerous and desperate. Attila was not destined to enter either Old or New Rome. But though Constantinople was saved, Theodosius and his ministers could not save themselves from the necessity of ratifying humiliating terms of peace. Attila was to retain the southern bank of the Danube. The Hunnish prisoners and deserters were to be sent back. Roman captives to be ransomed at 12 pounds of gold a head. 6,000 pounds of gold were to be paid at once, and an annual subsidy of 2,100 pounds. A great empire could hardly have descended to lower depths of ignominy. Matters were little better at home. The eunuch Chrysaphius was all-powerful at court. Pulcheria had long been growing more and more helpless, and probably in 447 she withdrew into private life. Arcadia had died in 444, in 449 Marina followed her, and during the last year of his life the emperor was alone, divorced from his wife, estranged from the sister who had sacrificed her best years for him, far distant from his daughter in the west. Now religious strife was added to his troubles. It had been in 431 necessary to hold a synod to deal with the heterodox patriarch Nestorius. Now in 449 the Monophysite heresy of Eutyches, which maintained the existence of a single nature only in the personality of our Saviour, raised its head. Chrysaphius was the godson of Eutyches, and the synod held at Ephesus to inquire into the question was packed with Monophysites, who maltreated Flavian, patriarch of Constantinople, and finally carried their point by sheer force. Leo, the famous Pope of Rome, whose legate Hilarius barely escaped with his life, aptly termed the meeting the Synod of Robbers. But Theodosius confirmed its decision and rent Christendom in twain. It was well that the domination of the evil eunuch was drawing to a close. In July 450, Theodosius, while following the chase, was thrown from his horse and so terribly injured that he was carried back only to die. As he lay in agony, his thoughts turned from the fawning eunuch, who had been his evil genius, to one who in the best years of his reign had been ever at his side, who to serve him had foregone her hopes of motherhood. He sent for Pulcheria, and when she came to the imperial chamber where the angel of death waited, the dying emperor made his peace with the sister who had served him so faithfully, and solemnly commended her to the Senate as his successor. A female ruler was an unheard-of thing in Roman annals. Pulcheria chose as her colleague a tried soldier and administrator, the patrician Marcianus, whom on August 24th, 450, she solemnly married. The marriage was but a formal one. Both bride and bridegroom were past middle life. Pulcheria would hardly break her vow. The nuptial ceremony was the sign of the comradeship of these two fine characters in their appointed task of reviving the apparently moribund empire. Their first act was to repudiate the disgraceful treaty with the Huns. It was a bold act, but it met with the success which sometimes waits on the brave. Chrysaphius was summarily put to death. Every effort was made to heal the schism in the church. Eutyches was degraded, and in 451 a general council was held at Chalcedon, by which the Monophysite heresy was solemnly condemned. The Huns made an inroad into the empire in 451, which was repelled with ease. It was probably only subsidiary to the gigantic invasion of the West which Attila carried out in this year, and which Aetius, Roman general and patrician, and Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, turned back on the Catalaunian plain. In 452 an alliance was effected with the Western Empire, and next year Attila's last invasion, in which he desolated northern Italy, was finally checked by Aetius. By the intercession of Pope Leo, as legend declares, by the aid of the reinforcements which Marcianus had sent to the west, as it appears in the sober light of history. If he really had Rome at his mercy, as we are required to believe, Leo could never have saved it. No one would rob the noble bishop of his glory, but Aetius and Marcianus must receive their due. Pulcheria died on September 11th, 453. Marcianus survived her for a little more than 3 years, busy until the last in the work of reorganization. On the murder of the wretched Valentinian III in 455, he became the legal head of the entire empire, but he was too wise to assume direct control over the ruinous West. He accepted as colleague Avitus, who on the murder of Maximus, the successor of Valentinian, was preferred to the imperial diadem by the army and the Visigoths in Gaul. He made efforts to repeople the Balkan provinces by settling colonies of brave barbarians, hostile in feeling to the Huns, in the devastated lands along the Danube. After the sack of Rome by Gaiseric in 455, he sent in succession 2 embassies to Carthage to endeavour to procure the release of the unhappy Empress Eudocia and her daughters. Both failed in their object, and Marcianus was preparing for war when he died in January 457. He is said to have been poisoned by Aspar, but he had certainly been in failing health for some time previous to his death. Be this as it may, Aspar undoubtedly did make a serious effort to play the part in the east which Ricimer was acting in the west. His Arian tenets made it somewhat difficult for him to seize the crown. Possibly he lacked the requisite resolution and unscrupulousness, but his control over the army rendered him for the time all-powerful, and he procured the election as emperor of Leo the Thracian, a man of considerable capacity but the head of his own household. The new emperor, however, showed himself possessed of independence and firmness, and manifested no signs of subordinating his policy to the ideas or ambitions of Aspar. He drew closer to the anti-Teutonic party in the empire. He married his daughter Ariadne to Zeno the Isaurian, one of its leading members, and set himself quietly to reorganize the army by enlisting many new regiments from among the native populations. In 463 Zeno was created Magister Militum per Orientem, and the control of one of the strongest armies of the empire was thus in the hands of a faithful friend. Still, Leo showed no unkindness or ingratitude to Aspar. He made his son, rather unwillingly and tardily it is true, Caesar, and the Allan general continued to be the foremost figure in Constantinople, where he lived in great state for many years. But Leo steadily abstained from permitting him any great military command. In 467 the emperor, who had in 462 succeeded in obtaining the release by Gaiseric of the unhappy Empress Eudocia and her younger daughter Placidia, sent a great expedition against the Vandals. It totaled about 100,000 men of all kinds, and 1,113 vessels. The total of the actual landing force may have been about 30,000. It was a far larger force than that which, 66 years later, was to conquer the Vandals. But Leo's distrust of Aspar induced him to give the command to Basiliscus, the incompetent brother of his wife Verina. The expedition was completely defeated, and its huge cost crippled imperial finances for a generation. In 471, Aspar met his end. It is probable that he had been plotting against the emperor, for Leo would hardly have proceeded to extremities without good reason, though it is true that the cause of his action may simply have been that these alien soldiers were dangerous subjects. At any rate, Aspar and his son, the Caesar Ardaburius, were executed, perhaps we should say assassinated. 2 younger sons of the general were spared. Leo's action was politically justifiable. He certainly showed no unnecessary lust of blood, but it cost him much of his popularity in the capital, where men called him in consequence Mechellus, butcher. In the same year we hear of a victory of the Roman army in Pontus, probably over a Hunnish host which had come round by the eastern shore of the Euxine. The rest of Leo's reign appears to have passed in comparative peace. His financial administration was directed to relieving, as far as possible, the burdens of the taxpayers, and on the occasion of a severe shock of earthquake at Antioch he was quick to extend aid. His military measures have been noticed. He maintained the cause of orthodoxy in the Church, and for this reason presumably obtained the undeserved title of great from his ecclesiastical panegyrists. He died in 474, aged 63, leaving an empire decidedly improved in condition and prospects to his infant grandson Leo II, the son of Zeno the Isaurian. It was clear that the imperatorship of Leo II was but nominal. With Zeno and Ariadne all real authority was certain to rest. The child was induced to formally abdicate in favour of his father, which probably was what the late emperor expected, though he does not seem to have cared to offend his wife Verina and her brother Basiliscus by formally naming the Isaurian his successor. Verina in 475 raised a revolt in the capital and set up Basiliscus as emperor. Zeno was forced to fly with his wife and his mother Lalice to Isauria. After a time the tide turned in his favour, and in 477 he was able to defeat the rebels and re-enter his capital. Basiliscus and his family were immured in a Cappadocian fortress, where they died of hunger and cold, and Zeno got rid of other dangerous persons by assassination. The last stronghold of the rebels, long beleaguered, was finally taken in 484. For the greater part of his reign Zeno was troubled by the Ostrogoths. Zeno took the great Gothic chief Theodoric, afterwards king of Italy, into his service, but in 479 he resolved to be no longer a traitor to his countrymen, and united their scattered bands against the empire. In 483 Zeno conciliated him by conferring on him the title of Magister Militum, just as Arcadius had tried to conciliate Alaric. But he soon broke out again into hostility, and in 487 marched on Constantinople. He met with no success, however, and in 488 Zeno got rid of him by making him a grant of Italy. The series of ephemeral rulers in the west had ended in Italy with the deposition of Romulus Augustus in 476, and Odovacar, the barbarian Magister Militum, declined to accept Zeno's suggestion that Julius Nepos of Dalmatia should be emperor of the West. He formally acknowledged Zeno as supreme emperor, and sent him the regalia from Ravenna, but proclaimed himself king in Italy. Zeno had therefore a legitimate casus belli, according to Roman ideas, and he now by this clever move theoretically brought the West again under his direct rule, and freed Balkania from the Germans. Theodore defeated and murdered Odovacar and ruled Italy and western Illyricum for 33 years. Actually, he was independent. In theory, he was the Roman patrician governing the prefecture of Italy in the name of the empire. Zeno's last years were passed in peace. He was never popular. He was regarded, like the rest of his countrymen, as no better than a barbarian. Footnote: his true Isaurian name was Tarasicordissa, that of his father Rhosombulotus. End of footnote. And the favour which he showed them exasperated the pampered Constantinopolitans. His financial policy was not successful, but we must remember that he had the Goths on his hands, though no doubt his lavishness to the Isaurians increased his difficulties. He was not a favourite with the Orthodox Church party owing to his efforts to conciliate the Nestorians and Monophysites. The real work of his reign, in which he was entirely successful, was the formation of a native army. He died in 491. His children had all predeceased him, and the supreme power devolved on his widow Ariadne. On April 11th the Empress chose as her colleague Flavius Anastasius of Dyrrachium, one of the Silentiaries, a guard of nobles which formed the Emperor's personal escort, and 6 months later formally espoused him. Personal liking may have had something to do with what appears to have been an unexpected choice. Anastasius, a man of handsome presence even in age, with brilliant unlike eyes, may have attracted the notice of the Empress, but he was otherwise well fitted to wear the crown. Ariadne's choice offended the Isaurian entourage of the late emperor, headed by his brother Longinus and the Magister Militum per Illyricum of the same name. They raised a revolt in the capital, which was only suppressed after severe fighting. The brother of Zeno was taken and tonsured, but the Magister Militum escaped to Isauria and called his wild countrymen to arms. They advanced 100,000 strong on the capital, but were defeated at Cottiaeum in Phrygia. In 493 the Isaurian fortress of Claudiopolis was stormed. In 494 the rebels were badly beaten close by, but it was not until 496 that the revolt was finally suppressed, though it had long ceased to be formidable. In 493 the Slavs made an inroad into Thrace, and in 499 and again in 502 the Bulgarians also invaded the empire. To protect the suburban districts of the capital, Anastasius in 512 drew a wall across the Thracian peninsula about 30 miles from Constantinople. Disturbances on the Syrian frontier in 498 were successfully put down, and the commercial entrepot of Jotaba in the Red Sea, which had been lost in the reign of Leo I, was recovered. In 502, after a peace of 80 years, war once more broke out with Persia. That great Oriental empire had been for many years involved in troubles with a Central Asiatic horde known as the Hathul or Ephthalite Huns. They were at present more or less quiescent, and the activity of Anastasius on his eastern frontier alarmed King Kobad. In 502 the Persians captured Martyropolis and Theodosiopolis, and next year Amida also. The Roman troops had become unused to regular warfare, owing to their guerrilla experiences in Isauria, and seemed unable at first to cope with the Persians. A victory which they gained at Nisibis was offset by 2 Persian successes. But in 504 the main Persian force under its king was beaten at Edessa, and the Roman army recovered Amida and ravaged the Persian border districts. Meanwhile the Huns invaded Persia, and thereupon Kobad made peace, restoring his trifling conquests. 3 years later Anastasius built a strong fortressed city on the site of Dara, a Mesopotamian village. It was only a few miles from the Persian frontier stronghold of Nisibis, which it was calculated to watch, and constituted a continual eyesore to the Persians. Anastasius, though at the outset of his reign he had been popular, soon lost favor with the population of the capital. His care for the finances caused him to be accused of miserliness, while his religious sympathies were Monophysite, thus exposing him to the often openly expressed dislike of the city factions. His religious heterodoxy probably had something to do with the rebellion of Count Vitalian, a grandson of Aspar, which broke out in 514. Vitalian inflicted a great defeat on the imperial forces at Odessus in Thrace, and the emperor, now in extreme old age, tried to conciliate him by creating him Magister Militum per Thracius. In 515 Vitalian was outside the capital, but his fleet was beaten off Chrysopolis, and he retreated to the Danube. A raid of Huns in the same year into Asia Minor did some damage, but had no permanent results. Anastasius died in 518 at the age of 88, after a reign of over 27 years. His financial policy had been highly beneficial. He reformed the curial system, and the taxes were henceforth farmed by imperial officials, thus guarding against the defrauding of the treasury by curials and provincial governors in collusion, while the interests of the taxpayers were protected by the formation of a new body of officials called defensores. Given that the latter did their work honestly, the system was not a bad one. It was certainly less harsh and unjust than the curial order of things. Anastasius sternly checked the peculation rife among the civil officials, and so has been misrepresented by at least one of them, who wrote in later years, and like most officials, whatever their department or degree, wrote rather as an official than a patriot. But his greatest reform was the abolition of the Chrysargyron, which was hailed with universal joy. The emperor expended large sums in public works, but despite all these expenses, and the cost of the wars which troubled his reign, he left a treasury reserve of 320,000 pounds of gold, about 14 million pounds sterling, an army in which the native element decidedly outbalanced the foreign mercenaries, and the empire in better order, on the whole, than it had been for a century and more. Anastasius left no children, but had 2 nephews, Hypatius and Pompeius. They were men of little merit. Hypatius was discredited in the public eye by his bad conduct at Odessus, where he had been defeated by Vitalian. Amantius, a eunuch of the court, perhaps designed to place one of them on the throne, and approached Justinus, a brave but illiterate veteran who commanded the imperial guard. He placed in his hands a large sum with which to bribe the officers under his command. Justinus used the money to secure his own elevation, and when he came forward he was accepted willingly by Senate and army. He reigned for 9 peaceful years, and followed on the whole in the steps of Anastasius, except in religious matters. In spite of his want of instruction, he was certainly no nonentity. His nephew Justinian was his colleague during the greater part of his reign, but it was not until after the old emperor's death that he broached his schemes of conquest. Vitalian was conciliated and made consul, but died soon after, assassinated, so the gossips of Constantinople insisted, by Justinian. The latter was consul in 521 and entertained the population of the capital with magnificent shows and games. Thenceforth he was practically his uncle's colleague. Justinian, the son of Justin's deceased brother Sabatius, was a staid personage of over 30, much given to deep study. one of those men whom the present age dubs old-fashioned. Nobody, people said, could ever recollect him being young. His natural abilities were not, probably, above the ordinary, but his powers of application were considerable, and he was a tireless worker. His attainments in law were unquestionably very great, and he had considerable aptitude for theology. He had the ability to form great and far-reaching designs and the perseverance necessary to carry them out. He had no military knowledge. In consequence, his vast plans were often very badly executed, and he seems to have lacked the discrimination of character which is absolutely necessary for the complete mental equipment of a despotic monarch. He was soon to amaze people by committing the very last action which would have been expected of him. In 526 it was bruited abroad in Constantinople that the grave, serious, old young Caesar, the student and thinker whose knowledge was so tremendous that according to the ignorant dwellers in the poorer quarters he was often seen walking about without his head, was in love with the beautiful dancer Theodora, whose reputation was really too dreadful for words. The theatrical profession at this day has not the best of reputations with certain classes, but it is savoury compared with that which it bore in the Roman Empire in the year 526. It is possible today for an actress to escape the imputation of having at some time or other slipped in the mire of immorality, but under the pagan Roman Empire actresses were either slaves or prostitutes or both. And whether they were invariably the latter under Christian rule or not, they were usually so regarded. The delight of scandalmongers, when the news of Justinian's love affair spread abroad, may be imagined. A love affair it certainly was. What other reason for such an occurrence can there be? If the Caesar needed a beautiful partner, he could take his choice of hundreds of lovely candidates, with advantages of birth and breeding which Theodora cannot have had. She was probably poor. Her profession was regarded as disgraceful. Justinian knew that he must meet condemnation on every hand, that he could not even legally marry her. He was certainly not too old to know deep and passionate love. It may very well be, to the writer it appears so, that his passion for Theodora was the single powerful human emotion that ever affected his peculiar, coldly intellectual temperament. Theodora was the daughter of Acacius, an attendant of the hippodrome at Constantinople, and her first public appearance is said to have been after the death of her father, when she and her two sisters wandered round the arena begging the charity of the spectators. Thereafter she had become a public dancer, and, as dancers did and do, doubtless often performed in scanty attire. Quite possibly she did not escape the contagion of immorality. Procopius probably lies in his bitter secret history, but there must have been some foundation for his tales, though slander often rests on a very slender basis of fact. In 526 she was a young widow, with one or two little children, short of stature, slight and delicate of appearance, pale-faced but superlatively lovely, with wonderful expressive eyes. Justinian announced to his uncle and mother his intention of wedding Theodora. They bitterly opposed him. The old emperor threatened to disown him, but the stubborn Caesar, to whom love had come so late, remained steadfast, and at last prevailed. Theodora's personality would seem to have completed the victory, for she was ennobled by having the title of patrician conferred upon her, a strange step for the old emperor to take unless he had convinced himself that she was not the foul creature that she was represented to be. It would have been so easy to have solved the difficulty by quietly executing a woman who was little more than a slave, that it is difficult to believe that Justinian's mother at least was not convinced of her comparative innocence. At all events the deed was done. Justinian took to wife the dancing girl of the circus, and ere long had every reason to be thankful. In April 527 he was proclaimed Augustus, thereby formally becoming his uncle's colleague, and in August the aged Justinus passed away. End of section 3.
The Byzantine Empire, the Rearguard of European Civilization, by Edward Ford. Chapter 4. Justinian I, AD 527 to 565. Justinian I, his aims, First Persian War, the Nika sedition, conquest of Vandals, first conquest of Italy, Justinian's legislative works, his buildings, heavy taxation, the Second Persian War, Ostrogothic rally under Badulla, the Great Plague, loss of Italy, death of Theodora, estimate of her character, Lazic War, final conquest of Italy and destruction of Ostrogoths, defeat of Franks, ruin of Italy, conquest of southern Spain, decay in Justinian's later years, Hunnish invasion, death of Justinian. On the death of his uncle, Justinian, without opposition, though there was still a considerable party in favour of the nephews of Anastasius, quietly succeeded to the undivided exercise of the authority which he had shared with Justin for several years. The great object of his policy, in the pursuit of which he never wavered all through his long reign, was to reduce the West once more under the direct authority of the empire. Theoretically, of course, no province, with the exception of Britain, had fallen away. Actually, the West was independent, and if in Italy the rule of the great Theodoric had probably been highly beneficial, the other regions were more or less rapidly becoming barbarized. The government of such rulers as Gaiseric was probably unmitigatedly bad. Where its results, as under Theodoric, were good, they still depended entirely upon the personality of the king for the time being. The provincials had no guarantee for the continuance of peace and good government. To Justinian, such a condition of things must have been intolerable, and quite apart from his natural desire as Roman emperor to reunite the disintegrating heritage of Theodosius, the restoration of the lost regions to the blessings of Roman government and civilization must have always appeared to him in the light of a sacred duty. Nor is it possible to urge against this view, which was probably that of the educated classes as a whole, the argument that the provinces would probably be wrecked in the reconquest. The obvious reply is that some short-lived suffering is better than irretrievable ruin and relapse into barbarism. As a matter of fact, Africa was recovered within a year at the slightest possible cost of life and property. And had a great military ruler directed the attack on Italy, it probably would have been won back in a couple of years, and the way cleared for the reconquest of Gaul and Spain. To an emperor of warlike ability, wielding the great resources of the East, the recovery of the West was not a task of insurmountable difficulty. That it was only partially accomplished must be attributed largely to Justinian's limitations of character and ability, partly also to certain external circumstances over which he had no control. Since his foreign policy was the keystone of his designs, it was unfortunate in the last degree that he possessed no military talent. Further, he had not an unreasonable dread of the possible results of entrusting large powers to capable and ambitious generals. Justinian was also continually hampered by the hostility of Persia in the east and by barbarian raids on the Balkan Peninsula. At the very outset of his reign, Justinian had a foretaste of the trouble which Persia was to cause him. The new frontier fortress of Dara, or Anastasiopolis, where the Roman commander in the east now had his headquarters, was a standing eyesore to the Persians. And Justinian had perhaps already, as Justin's colleague, made evident his policy of conciliating the petty kingdoms on his eastern frontier, and so forming a line of buffer states against the Sassanids. In 527 he appointed a favourite young officer, Belisarius the Thracian, who had married his wife's friend Antonina, governor of Dara, and directed him to construct a fort close to Nisibis. This action appeared to threaten the Persian frontier fortress, and King Kobad declared war. Early in 528, a force of 30,000 Persians under Xerxes, a prince of the royal house, defeated the Roman troops which covered the new frontier post and captured and destroyed it. Xerxes followed up his blow by directing a raid into Syria, which effected much damage, and which the Romans, who were distracted by a revolt of the Samaritans in Palestine, only feebly opposed, though they replied to it later in the year by making a counter-raid into Adia Bene. The revolt was suppressed, and late in the year Belisarius, quite possibly by petticoat influence, for he was only 25, and had hardly distinguished himself so far, was appointed Magister Militum per Orientum. A veteran soldier, Hermogenes, however, was appointed chief of staff. In 530 the Persians invaded Roman Mesopotamia, 40,000 strong, including at least a part of the famed immortals. Belisarius and Hermogenes, with little more than 20,000 men, gave them battle under the walls of Dara and gained a complete victory, while a little later a second Persian force, which had entered Armenia, was routed by the general Dorotheus. The Persian plan of campaign had thus completely miscarried, but there was great disagreement between the young Magister Militum and his subordinates, and the success was not followed up. Next year, taking advantage of these dissensions, the Persians turned the Roman position in Mesopotamia by crossing the Euphrates at Callinicum, and Belisarius came up with part of his forces in time only to receive a severe defeat. It was evident that, whatever his ability might be, the young general could not control his officers, and he was superseded by the Gepid leader Mundus, who retrieved the disgrace of Callinicum by completely defeating the Persians at Martyropolis in Mesopotamia. Both sides were now weary of the war. The Persians could make no headway, and Justinian, anxious to have his hands free for the prosecution of his designs in the west, was not averse to making one or two slight concessions for the sake of peace on the Euphrates. A treaty was concluded in 532, by which Persia undertook to keep the Caucasian defiles closed against barbarian eruptions into either empire, while Justinian agreed to contribute £11,000 of gold to provide for the maintenance of the necessary garrisons, and to withdraw the headquarters of the Eastern Army from Dara to Constantina, some distance in the rear, thus relieving the Persians from the real or fancied menace of a Roman force constantly on the borderline. He doubtless considered peace in the East cheaply bought for a sum which was probably less than the cost of another campaign, but the money payment could be, and no doubt was, regarded by the Persians as blackmail. The First Persian War ended. Justinian hoped to be able to turn his attention to the west, but before he could do so he had to face a grave domestic peril in a revolt of the circus-named demes of the capital. These were neither more nor less than political factions, which used the colours of the charioteers of the Hippodrome as their badges and appellations. The outbreak has often been regarded as a last expiring flash of popular independence. The writer begs leave to question this. There will be reason hereafter to show that the populace of Constantinople was always ready to express its opinion in vigorous fashion at a crisis. Be that as it may, it threatened the existence of the Dardanian imperial line. Justinian, being himself orthodox, was inclined to favour the blue faction against the Greens, who were Monophysite, and in favour of the nephews of Anastasius. But for a constitutional monarch, and the Roman emperors were very decidedly such, despite their imposing semi-religious titles and pretensions, to be in sympathy with a political party is not to say that he must wink at their infractions of the law. Moreover, though the emperor was blue, Theodora in her dancing days had won the colours of the Greens, and was naturally inclined to sympathise with them. On Sunday, January 11, 532, the Greens formally complained by their demarch to the emperor of the injustice of which they had had to endure at the hands of some officials. The complaint was made, as usual, in the Hippodrome, the crowd assembled to witness the races always furnishing a good opportunity for the people to state their grievances. The Blues violently interrupted their rivals, and a tumult arose which was not quieted until blood had been shed. 7 ringleaders were arrested and condemned to death, and Justinian refused to exercise his prerogative of mercy in favour of those of them who belonged to the blue faction. The result was disastrous. The Blues turned against an emperor who, unjustly as they considered, would not protect them against the consequences of their misdeeds, and began to make overtures towards reconciliation with the Greens. Next day, a vast sullen crowd collected to witness the execution of the ringleaders. The hangman lost his head and bungled his work, and 2 half-hanged men were rescued and placed in sanctuary. This open defiance of the law was followed by a formal union of the factions. They took as their war cry the word Nika, victory. Next day, Justinian was confronted in the Hippodrome by the entire mob of rioters, which furiously demanded the dismissal of the city prefect Eudemius, the man immediately responsible for the late executions, of Tribonian, a famous lawyer, now questor, and of John of Cappadocia, the finance minister. One touch of taxes makes the whole world kin, and evidently the exactions under Justinian were already more severe than in the days of Anastasius. Moreover, John and Tribonian had evil reputations for honesty in financial matters. Justinian had with him in the palace of reliable troops only 1 regiment of mailed horsemen, and a force of Herul and Gepid foederati, probably not more than 2,000 men in all. The 5 scholae of the guard were about 4,000 strong, but under Justinian they had tended more and more to become a merely ornamental body. There were, no doubt, plenty of gallant gentlemen in their ranks, but mere undisciplined gallantry is not worth a great deal in street fighting, and many members of the scholae were not even fighting men. Justinian evidently thought that the situation demanded conciliatory handling. On the 14th he dismissed the unpopular officials and replaced them by men acceptable to the people, but the rioting continued. The emperor had at his disposal both Belisarius and Mundus, and the former moved out against the rebels with the Teutonic troops. The next 4 days were marked by desperate street fighting, in which the rebels held their own stoutly. Fires broke out everywhere, as the fierce mercenaries and infuriated rioters contended for the mastery, and on the 17th the whole eastern portion of the city was a mass of ruins. Only the huge fabric of the hippodrome still stood amid the mournful desolation, and formed the stronghold of the insurgents against the imperialists in the palace enclosure. Troops, meanwhile, had reached the palace by sea. The factions now had decided to crown as Augustus one of the nephews of Anastasius. They were, however, with Justinian in the palace. The part played by Hypatius is difficult of comprehension. The writer's opinion is that he was probably willing enough to be crowned, but lacked the energy and determination requisite for an imperial claimant. Justinian seems to have thought that he was less dangerous at large than in the palace, where his presence would rather stimulate the eagerness of the rebels to come at him. A fresh sortie made by the troops on this day was repelled, and then the emperor ordered Hypatius and Pompeius to leave the palace. Next day Justinian opened a parley. Coming onto the platform of the Kathisma, the imperial grandstand, he addressed the rebels, swearing on the Gospels that he would grant all their lawful demands and pardon all guilty of complicity in the revolt. No monarch could well do more. But he was greeted with jeers, missiles, and yells of execration, and his guards had to protect him back to the palace. Hypatius had been discovered and recognised, and though his wife strove to dissuade him from acceding to the insurgents' requests, he gave way. On the following morning he was crowned with her necklace, wreathed diadem-wise, in the Forum of Constantine. Whether he still attempted to remain faithful seems dubious. One account says that his course was finally determined by a false report that the emperor was in flight. Then he had no further doubts, and concentrating his followers in the hippodrome, received their homage before leading them against the palace. There was something like a panic. The finest part of the city was in ruins. The rebels were triumphant. The troops had lost heavily in the fighting, and their leaders were not confident. A council of war was held, and to it came the emperor and the empress, Belisarius and Mundus, and the chief ministers. Justinian laid before it the alternatives of continuing the apparently hopeless defence of the palace, or of withdrawing to Heraclea Pontica to rally the eastern army. The consequences of this latter step might easily have been fatal. Justinian had tried all means to subdue the revolt, and all had so far failed. He was a beaten man. Had he left Constantinople, he would have confessed his defeat to the world. Adherents would have flocked to his rival. It is probable that he never would have seen his capital again. Nevertheless, John of Cappadocia directly advised the step, and was supported by most of the ministers. Belisarius and Mundus appear to have concurred, perhaps because they thought that without the clogging responsibility of guarding the emperor they might do better. The impression given is that the sense of the council was practically unanimous. Then great-hearted Theodora rose in her wrath and fiercely denounced the project, which was approved by all the wisest and bravest heads of the empire. At this terrible hour, when the fate of the realm literally balanced on a razor's edge, the fiery courage of a woman turned the scale. Half Constantinople was in ruins, and the smoke of its burning was drifting over the Bosphorus. Tens of thousands of triumphant rebels were acclaiming a rival emperor hard at hand. The palace was full of beaten soldiery, and as she stood by the throne, storming her excited periods, her slim figure instinct with pride and contempt, her eyes glittering darkly in her little pale face, the ex-dancer looked down on defeated and disheartened men, wavering in the fatal irresolution that so often ends in crazy, helpless panic. "No time this," cried Theodora, "to pay regard to antiquated maxims, and so, though a woman, I will speak. Our dearest interests are at stake, and we must think of the wisest plan of action and of nothing else. Of course our counsellors advise flight. It is only natural. But if the natural course of action, even though it lead to safety, bring disgrace upon us, then it is but an evil one to follow. All men must die. But how much more terrible than death is it for a king to survive his kingship? Escape is very easy, my emperor. You have but to go on board ship and sail away. Nor need you want, for you have gold in plenty. But I tell you that when you have deserted your post as emperor, you will taste the very bitterness of death. And I, your wife, will not fly. I will not live to see the day when my purple robes are torn from me, and I am queen and mistress no more. Let us remain at our post and fight to the last. If we die, we meet our fate as becomes us, for empire is a glorious winding sheet. Theodora's fiery words and fiery gestures swept opposition before them. Her despondent husband and his timid counsellors caught courage from her speech. The failing hearts of the soldiers kindled again at the glance of the brave dancing girl, who perchance did hide in her bosom the recollection of past days that she fain would have forgotten, but who now, innocent or guilty, showed herself well worthy of the crown that her husband and sovereign had given her, a veritable queen of men. What further discussion there was is not known, but the results of the conference are certain. The eunuch Narses was sent out into the city, well provided with money, to endeavour to sow dissension among the not too solidly united factions, and every available man in the palace marched under Belisarius and Mundus to attack the rebels massed in the hippodrome. Belisarius made a direct attack upon the Kathisma, where Hypatius was now receiving the tumultuous homage of his supporters, while Mundus moved against the eastern side of the huge enclosure. Belisarius was repelled from the Kathisma, where the picked men of the factions made a desperate and successful resistance. So, leaving the portion of his force to mask it, he turned the remainder upon the western entrances, which he finally succeeded in carrying, just as the column of Mundus fought its way in by the Gate of the Dead on the east. The insurgents fought desperately, but were at a hopeless disadvantage before the trained soldiers, cooped up in an enclosure of which all the main exits were occupied, and a frightful massacre was made of them by the furious troops, who had a week of ill success to avenge. The loss of life has been rated as high as 50,000. It must in any case have been enormous. Hypatius and Pompeius were taken and executed. The extent of their guilt is difficult to estimate, but Hypatius had allowed himself to be crowned as a rival to the emperor. It does not appear that Justinian could, in the circumstances, have acted otherwise. The Persian trouble got rid of, only temporarily as it proved, an internal disaffection quelled by the terrible lesson of the Nika revolt, Justinian was at last able to turn his attention to the west. There the circumstances were extremely favourable. Theodoric the Great had died in 526, and his successor, Athalaric, followed in 533. Athalaric's mother, Amalasuntha, the Romanizing daughter of Theodoric, succeeded him, but was murdered by the worthless husband, Theodahat, whom she had taken in deference to the prejudice that no woman could rule alone over Goths, a prejudice probably well justified in the present case. In Africa, Hilderic, king of the Vandals, had been dethroned by his cousin Geilemir, perhaps the most thoroughly incapable monarch who had sat so far on any of the kingly thrones in the Teutonic West. Justinian declared war upon him as soon as peace had been made with Persia, and with diplomatic astuteness alleged as his reason that Geilemir had wrongfully deposed Hilderic, the friend and ally of Rome. The premature disclosure of the great design of recovery of all the West would probably have united Franks, Goths and Vandals in a solid phalanx of resistance. In July 533, Belisarius, now in high favour for his services in the Nika sedition, sailed from Constantinople for Africa with 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry on 500 transports escorted by 92 men of war. The armament put in at Tripolis, the easternmost Vandal town, which was at once betrayed by its inhabitants, and whence the army advanced cautiously along the coast on Carthage. Geilemir was utterly unprepared. His best general, his brother Tzazo, was in Sardinia. He sent to recall him and gathered his levies, but so great was the confusion and unreadiness of these erstwhile terrors of the empire that not until Belisarius's slow advance had reached the 10th milestone from Carthage were the Vandals able to offer battle. They made a poor resistance, were routed and scattered, and the Roman army marched into Carthage the next day. Geilemir would probably have submitted there and then, but Tzazo had now reached Africa from Sardinia. he rallied the disheartened levies of his brother and advanced with him to retake Carthage. Belisarius moved out from the city to deal with the Vandal rally, and the opposing forces blundered into each other at Tricameron, on the road from the capital to Bulla. The Vandals were once more routed and Sarzo slain. Guylemir fled into the mountains, but the rough fare of the Moors with whom he took refuge soon became intolerable to his weak, luxurious nature, and he surrendered, asking only for a harp with which to sing the dirge for the Vandals, a sponge with which to dry his tears, and a loaf of bread, a delicacy which he had not tasted among the Moors. If the fallen monarch really did send this miserable message, he could hardly have done anything better calculated to make him an object of utter contempt. The conquest of the African coast to the Pillars of Hercules was rapidly and easily accomplished, and Belisarius returned to Constantinople with his royal prisoner, a long train of noble captives, and the vast treasures of the Vandal king, the fruits of many years of unrestrained piracy on land and sea. In 535, Justinian declared war on Theodahat of Ostrogothia, using as a pretext this time the king's murder of his wife. Theodahat was a sufficiently poor creature, and the collapse of the Vandals cowed him. He made no preparation for war, but spent much time in consulting astrologers and sorcerers. He was ready to resign his great heritage without a blow, but there was plenty of good material in his nation, and the noble Ostrogothic race was not to fall without a desperate struggle. 2 invasions of the Ostrogothic kingdom were planned. Belisarius, sole consul for the year 535, was to invade Italy with a force of only 7,500 men. This seems so utterly insignificant that it must be supposed that it was exclusive of the general's huge comitatus of 7,000 troops. Even so, it was sufficiently weak for the task before it. Mundus, now governor of Illyricum, was to reconquer Dalmatia and Pannonia. Belisarius landed in Sicily, and by the end of the year had conquered the island. Only Paranormus seems to have made any resistance. Mundus, meanwhile, had taken Salona and conquered Dalmatia, but in the midst of his successes he was attacked by a large Gothic army, defeated and slain. This victory, however, did not benefit the Goths. They were forced to retreat before the successor of Mundus, and ultimately Dalmatia was firmly held by the Imperialists. Such success as the Goths had gained was not owing to the exertions of Theodahat, who appears to have been really crazy with fright. When early in 536 Belisarius crossed the Straits of Messina and took Rhegium, the Gothic host could bear no more. They promptly slew the miserable creature who sat on the throne of Theodoric the Great, and elected an elderly chief named Witiges, a respectable warrior of the drill sergeant type, and a man of integrity, but not the leader for a great occasion. Belisarius for the time did not advance. The newly conquered province of Africa was in a ferment. Part of the troops had mutinied and had been joined by the remnant of the Vandals. Belisarius hastened to Carthage and defeated the rebels on the Bagradus. Then, having apparently reduced the revolt to manageable proportions, he returned to Italy. Meanwhile the Franks, possibly stirred up by Justinian's diplomacy, were threatening the Ostrogoths from the north, and King Witiges was drawn away to oppose them. Belisarius, marching northward from Rhegium, was very feebly opposed. There were only 4,000 Goths under Ludarus, even in Rome itself. Naples was taken by surprise after a blockade of 3 weeks, and then Belisarius advanced on Rome. His army was reduced to a shadow by the numerous garrisons which he had been forced to leave behind, but the very stars in their courses seemed to fight for him. His advance was unopposed. Ludarius lost his head and gave the order for retreat, and Belisarius marched triumphantly into Rome from the southeast, just as the Goths were leaving it on the north on December the 10th, 536. Witiges, having bought off the Franks by ceding Provence, could now turn against the Romans. In the spring of 537 he arrived before Rome with the whole host of the Ostrogoths, over 100,000 strong, and beleaguered the city for 12 months. Belisarius had only some 5,000 troops wherewith to defend the vast circuit of the walls of Aurelian and Honorius, and that, with such feeble resources, he was able to repel assault after assault, and to hold out until famine and pestilence broke up the siege, speaks volumes for the helplessness of the Goths and the incapacity of their leader. The blockade was never complete or effective, and reinforcements and convoys of supplies were able to find their way in. The final column of reinforcement, which arrived in February of 538, was 5,000 strong. Success on the part of the Goths was now not to be hoped for. In March they abandoned the siege and retreated northward. Belisarius caught their rearguard at Pons Milvius and totally defeated it. Later in the year, a fresh force of 7,000 men under John, the son of Count Vitalian, took Ariminum. The imperial troops now concentrated in Rome. Besides Belisarius, there were John and Narses, the eunuch whom we have already met in the Nika sedition, and none had any definite primacy. Finally, however, Narses was recalled, and Belisarius, left in chief command, captured Faesulae and Auximium, and cautiously felt his way towards Ravenna. The Franks had broken the peace, made in 536, and again invaded Italy. The Goths were defeated, the plain of the Po wasted. Witigis seemed helpless. In May 540, Belisarius occupied Ravenna, having starved the city into submission. There fell into his hands King Witigis, many nobles, and a great hoard of treasure. The admiring Goths offered the regality to the victorious general. But whatever his private ambition may have been, Belisarius had no thought of disloyalty. He returned to Constantinople with his captives and spoil, and so twice within 7 years Justinian saw a conquered king at the foot of his throne. Italy seemed conquered. Only a small Gothic force still remained in the valley of the Po, and yet almost all that had been conquered was to be lost again, and 12 years were to elapse before the final victory was won. The Gothic remnant was led in quick succession by 2 chiefs, Hildebald and Eraric. Then, in 541, the leadership passed to Badula, a man to be named with all honour and reverence, possessed of all the qualities that make for true nobility. Badula quickly showed that the Gothic spirit was not extinct. When in 542 the Imperialists began to collect for the conquest of the Po Valley, he boldly advanced against them and defeated them at Faenza. Following up his success, he routed John, son of Vitalian, at Megillo and shut up the remains of his army in Ravenna. He then pushed forward the work of reconquest and met with little opposition. The year 540 marks the highest point of Justinian's reign. While his foreign policy was everywhere meeting with brilliant success, he was busy with great works at home. In 528, a commission, including the great jurist Tribonian, began to codify the laws. It had the Theodosian code upon which to work, and in little more than a 12-month had completed its labours. This was only a beginning. On December 15, 530, a second commission, presided over by Tribonian, set to work on a digest of the entire body of the laws of Rome. It was a gigantic task, but in 3 years it was completed. Then, to facilitate study, the Commission compiled a manual of the law in 4 volumes, the Institutes. It was really a new edition of the earlier commentaries of Gaius, with the alterations and notes necessitated by the changed times. At the same time, a course of study for intending lawyers was carefully examined and revised. Justinian was a builder on a gigantic scale. He had a fair field for his operations in Constantinople after the Nika sedition, but the capital was but one of the cities which he embellished or strengthened. In Anthemius of Trolls he had at his disposal one of the greatest of architects. Churches, basilicas, monasteries, fortresses, hospitals arose everywhere. The greatest of his monuments was the splendid Church of the Divine Wisdom in Constantinople, which has been more than once characterized as the most perfect specimen of a Christian temple that the world has ever seen. On its many glories we need not dwell. It is now a mosque of the Turks, but all their vandalism, all the effects of their wasting hand, have been unable to hide or destroy its majestic splendour. Sancta Sophia was but one of the many churches built or restored by Justinian, though by far the greatest. Even in newly conquered Ravenna, the imperial architects and builders were soon busy, and produced for the emperor San Vitale and San Apollinare in class, the former containing only attempts at likenesses, if such they can be called, of himself and his wife that we possess. His civil and military works were enormous. He built basilicas by the score, and fortresses and military towers literally by the 100, 294 in the Balkan provinces alone. But all these works, combined with the cost of administration and of continual warfare, required an enormous outlay. Justinian apparently never seriously trenched upon his huge treasury reserve, but paid for everything out of revenue. He was probably guiltless himself of any desire to oppress his people, but his agents carried on a continual process of grinding extortion, John of Cappadocia especially earning a terrible reputation. As early as 532 we find the Nika rioters complaining of severe taxation. it is not likely to have been diminished after the suppression of the revolt. There was war in Italy. In Africa, the Moors, the remnant of the Vandals and disaffected troops, gave trouble until 545. There were also hostilities in Illyricum, when in 540 Khusru Anushirvan, son of Kobad, king of Persia, very likely owing in some measure to Gothic intrigues, invaded Syria. Khusru did not care to waste his host on the walls of Dara and Edessa. He crossed the Euphrates at once into Syria and marched straight on Antioch. The apparent strength of the great city so impressed him that he offered to withdraw for 1,000 pounds of gold. But when his terms were rejected, he made a virtue of necessity, and probably rather to his surprise, stormed Antioch. Part of the garrison cut its way out, but the city was sacked, and thousands of inhabitants carried off to Persia. Khusru made no attempt to hold Antioch, but at once turned homeward. He went by way of Mesopotamia, and on his march attempted to crown his campaign by storming the Persian eyesore of Dara, but was handsomely repulsed by the garrison. In 541, Belisarius was appointed to the Eastern Command. Khusru advanced into Armenia and attacked the thin slip of Roman territory along the southeastern shore of the Euxine. He stormed the fortress of Petra, south of Phasis, but before he could do more, he was recalled by the news that Belisarius had fallen on Mesopotamia. The campaign ended without result. The war dragged on for some 3 years longer, but its history is devoid of interest. In 542 and 543, the great king gained 1 or 2 trifling successes, chiefly, as it would seem, because Belisarius was ill-supported. He captured Callinicum in 543. In 544, a Roman corps was defeated in Persia-Armenia. But in 545, the Persian Grand Army sustained a very bloody and humiliating repulse before Edessa. Thereupon the great king made overtures, and once more Justinian, to free his hands for operations in Italy, where matters were very serious, preferred to buy a truce at the rate of 2,000 pounds of gold. The peace, after all, was only partial. In Lazica, the Colchian inland, hostilities were expressly permitted to continue. Khusru had shown by his expedition in 542 that he had designs on this region. They appear to have aimed at pushing the Persian border through to an outlet on the Euxine. While the Persian War lasted, hostilities in Italy were little regarded. The troops there were left unreinforced and unsupplied. The pressure of taxation was cruel. In 542, a blow which could not be parried fell upon the empire in the form of a terrible outbreak of the plague. It was an epoch-making disaster. There can be no doubt that it so weakened the state as to make it practically powerless before any great shock from without. The population was probably nearly stationary at the best of times. The burden of taxation, the prevalence of monasticism, continual barbarian ravages in the Balkan provinces, not to mention other causes, must have tended to retard any increase, and the wasting hand of the pestilence made havoc that could only have been repaired under the most favourable circumstances. The mortality in Constantinople at the height of the scourge is said to have exceeded 5,000 a day. If so, the population of the capital can hardly have been diminished by less than 100,000 souls. The details, the all-searching and all-destroying infection, the helplessness of the pseudoscience of the day before it, the craven terror and panic, the general apathy and despair, are those of all similar visitations. Procopius naively says that its one marked characteristic was that it carefully spared the wicked. The plague almost paralysed Justinian's efforts for some time. The war in the east languished, Italy was left almost to itself, and Badulla gained ground fast. The emperor himself had had an attack of the disease, and it seems to have left him weakened both in body and mind. By 543, Badulla was master of most of northern Italy, excepting Ravenna and 1 or 2 isolated strongholds. He then crossed the Tiber, and avoiding Rome, where a strong force was stationed under Bessus, an able but harsh and avaricious officer, overran the southern provinces almost without resistance. Plague and lack of reinforcements rendered the imperialists helpless. He besieged and took Neapolis, and pushing on to the south, captured most of the Roman troops remaining in the fortress of Hydruntum. Then in 544 he turned back to besiege Rome, though he had only 15,000 men available for the great task. Late in the year Belisarius reached Italy, having again been appointed to the command. He retook Hydruntum and relieved Oximium, and in 545 proceeded, evidently by sea, to Ostia to do the same for Rome. Justinian had begun to distrust him. He was stinted in every way. His great veteran comitatus was withheld from him. His army was small and raw. Bessus had alienated the Romans by his harshness, and before Belisarius could obtain reinforcements with which to attempt the relief, for which he had sent home John, son of Vitalian, Rome fell by treachery. John, meanwhile, had come back with fresh troops and an independent command. He reconquered Apulia and Lucania without difficulty. Badula thereupon abandoned Rome, breaching its walls and deporting such of the population as remained, and marched to meet him. But as soon as he was gone, Belisarius reoccupied the city, and when the king turned back to retake it, he was repulsed. Beyond this, Belisarius could do nothing. For some 2 years he lay entrenched in the ruins of the great city, holding his own, but unable to advance. Elsewhere, the imperialists were confined to the walls of Ravenna, Oximium, Hydruntum, and Croton, and could not meet Badula in the field. The deadlock lasted for 2 years. Belisarius appealed in vain for supplies and reinforcements. He could only hold Rome, and Badula fitted out a fleet at Ancona, which ravaged the coast of Dalmatia, and sailing boldly to the west, wasted Sardinia. Then Belisarius heard of an event which he evidently regarded as fatal to all his hopes and prospects. He applied for permission to resign. It was granted, and he left Italy for the last time in 549. To the event which ruined his hopes we now turn. On July 27, 548, Theodora died. Her influence as empress appears to have been wholly for good. The stories of the secret history of Procopius are so contradictory that they cannot be believed. She doggedly opposed the evil finance minister, John of Cappadocia, and finally ousted and ruined him. She probably saw the bad effects of his measures better than her husband, obviously because she had personal experience of the hardships of poverty. Whenever she made her influence felt, it seems to have been exerted on the side of justice and wisdom. She was generous, pitiful to the oppressed, and if she were vain, her vanity is hardly to be put against her care for fallen woman. Charity, to the sinful of their own sex, is certainly not a female virtue. To the last, Justinian's affection for her never seems to have wavered. In Sancta Sophia we still may see the monogram of the imperial pair in the gallery, where they sat at public worship. His love episode is the one sympathetic trait in the character of the emperor, and with his brave wife the best of him lay dead. In the same unhappy year the Slavs ravaged Illyricum up to the walls of Dyrrhachium, and in 550 they made a fresh raid and sacked Topyrus in Thrace. The imperial troops seemed helpless to stay them. In 551 they were again raiding in Illyricum and Thrace, and defeated a small Roman force in the open field near Adrianople. Next year the raid was repeated. Justinian's attention was fixed on Lazica. He made hardly any attempt to succour Illyricum or Italy, where Badula recaptured Rome after the recall of Belisarius, and thenceforth held the entire country, except a few fortresses. For some time after Theodora's death, the emperor seems to have remained in a state of apathy, like that which paralysed the energies of a somewhat similar monarch, Philip II of Spain, in 1596. However, in 549 he roused himself and decided to end the partisan warfare in Lazica. A strong force was dispatched thither, which failed to take Petra, but routed a Persian division nearby. Next year the Persians were again defeated. Bessas, the general whom we have already met at Rome, put down a rising of the Abazgi in Colchis, and in 551 stormed Petra and routed the Persians at Archaeopolis. These successes were not continued in 552, though all went well for a time. The Roman army retreated in a panic when menaced with attack by a new Persian general, and was forced to the coast at Phasis. The Persians, 60,000 strong, followed it there in 553 and besieged it in its lines, but making an assault were totally defeated. There was further desultory fighting, but the Romans were now firmly established in Colchis, and in 556 peace was concluded for 50 years, Khusru receiving in lieu of Lazica £400 of gold a year. Once again the bad practice of money payments was adopted, but the fruits of the war lay with Justinian. The Persian hopes of pushing their border to the Euxine had been balked. In 552 Justinian had resolved on a final attempt to subdue Italy. A fleet and army were collected in Dalmatia under the command of Narses. Justinian would employ Belisarius no more. In justice it must be said that though the great general's second command in Italy was a failure, he came home wealthier than ever. we can hardly blame Justinian for distrusting him. Narses marched by land with his army and entered Italy from the north. The fleet defeated that of the Ostrogoths off Sena Gallica, and Narses reached Ravenna without opposition. He then, AD 553, advanced on Rome. At Tagina, in the Apennines, he met the great king of the Goths, and a desperate battle was fought. The Roman victory was complete. 6,000 Gothic knights perished, and worst of all, Badulla was slain. The end was nigh. Yet that sad end of a noble race had a tragic splendour. Narses occupied Rome, and moved on into Campania, where the broken army had rallied for a last stand under Tea, the best and bravest of Badulla's captains. Beneath Vesuvius, Narses came upon the last forlorn hope of Ostrogothia, and crushed it into all but total annihilation. Only 1,000 Ostrogoths stood to their arms after the battle, and Narses, with something we may believe of true admiration in his soul, gave them permission to leave Italy and go whither they would. So, with dead Tea on his shield at their head, as in life he had led them, the sad little column passed the Roman lines and went away, never to return. And with those grand warriors passing into the night of oblivion, the Ostrogothic nation disappears from history. As they told Narses, God was against them, but they had produced the greatest man of the 5th century, Theodoric, and Badulla and Tea, and now that they were gone, the world was poorer. All was not yet over. In their last agony, the Goths had sought aid from every side, and Theudebald of the Franks had permitted 2 chiefs, Bucelin and Clothar, to enter Italy with 80,000 men. They came too late to help Tea, but proceeded to waste Italy for their own benefit. One division perished of starvation and disease in Apulia. The other, under Bucelin, attacked Narses at Casilinum and was simply annihilated. Italy was Justinian's at last, but Italy so ruined as to be all but worthless. In many places the land was a vast solitude. Everywhere it was wasted and depopulated into hopeless poverty and misery. Nevertheless, it was Roman once more. Vandals and Ostrogoths had been swept away. The Franks had received a severe lesson. Now it was to be the turn of the Visigoths, the sackers of Rome in 410. In Spain, King Agila was in 554 engaged in civil war with a rebel, Athanagild. The latter was foolish enough to invite the help of Liberius, governor of Africa, who invaded the country and rapidly subdued most of the south and southeast. The Visigoths at last recognised their folly. They murdered Agila and acknowledged Athanagild as king. He was able to check the further progress of Liberius, but failed to recover the lost territory, which was held in whole or in part for some 60 years. Thus, by 556, Justinian had reconquered Italy, Illyricum, Africa, the islands of the western Mediterranean, and part of Spain, and had held Persia steadily in check. He had completed his legal reforms. The empire was covered with his monuments. But all this had been done at a cost of exactions which had entirely exhausted the state. The civil service was large and far too powerful. There is every reason to believe that it, and not Justinian, was responsible for many of the oppressions which weighed so grievously upon the suffering people. After his wife's death, Justinian distrusted everybody. His nephew, Justinus, who was married to Theodora's niece Sophia, was kept in the background, and the emperor, now more than 70 years of age, grew steadily weaker. His intellect was obviously failing. He seems to have lost in great measure even his love of hard work. He allowed the officials to gain power unchecked. The army fell into grave disorganisation. Barbarian raids were bought off. As his powers declined, he wasted much time on religious controversy, trying to coerce orthodox believers and monophysites into unwilling and unenduring agreement. The whole machine of government and defence was out of order when, in 558, a horde of Cotriga Huns made a daring raid into Thrace. They do not appear to have numbered 20,000 cavalry in all, and a body only 7,000 strong came close up to Constantinople. Belisarius, who was hastily called from his retirement to defend the capital, could only collect the useless Scholarians and a few hundred veteran horsemen. Infantry were of course useless, but the Huns were beaten without difficulty in an action at Melantius near Constantinople. Another of their corps was severely handled at the same time near Cardia, and the whole horde withdrew. Justinian now intrigued with the Utriga section of the Huns to attack the Cotrigas, and the two tribes, busy with fratricidal warfare, had no leisure for further raids. Belisarius, some 4 years later, was suspected of complicity in a conspiracy against the emperor's life. His property was sequestrated, and he was kept under arrest for several months. Justinian's conduct certainly appears contemptible, but it is very difficult to say whether it was, as Professor Oman thinks, unpardonable. At all events, he ended by restoring the general to favour and fortune. Belisarius died in March 565. His wife Antonina lived some years longer, and died at the great age of 80. The inhabitants of the Roman East were certainly not devoid of vigour. Justinian died on November 13, 565. His character has, as far as possible, been dealt with previously. With all his failings, he fills a large space on the Roman canvas, and if his undertakings were not always successful, we must remember his many difficulties. He has been compared with Louis XIV of France and with Philip II of Spain. The writer believes himself able to discern points of resemblance to both. He was clearly a better man than either, far less dissolute and ostentatious than the Frenchman, not a hypocritical bigot like the Spaniard. His first love was his last, and no La Vallière bewailed her fate at his hands. He was able in several ways, hard-working, thoroughly well-intentioned and conscientious. And so we leave him, the best known and yet most mysterious of the long line of Byzantine Caesars. End of section 4.